Morning, guys. Welcome back to our May 7th video lecture. Today we're going to be talking about Richard Nixon and the Watergate scandal. Let's go ahead and get right on into it. So, one night in D.C., on June 17th, 1972, five men broke into the offices of the Democratic National Committee located in the Watergate building in Washington, D.C. The security guard caught the oddly dressed burglars, who were fitted with suits and bugging or wiretapping devices. An investigation concluded that they had ties to Nixon's re-election campaign. Early news reports of the break-in did not prevent Nixon from winning the 1972 presidential election in what we talked about was a massive landslide, one of the most overwhelming presidential victories in U.S. history. But the bungled burglary and cover-up attempts would eventually lead to Richard Nixon's ultimate downfall. Okay? Abuse of power never before seen. Richard Nixon was a president unlike any other, and there's a number of reasons why that is true. But let's talk about Nixon's approach to the presidency and how he viewed power. Although the Watergate burglars' intentions were unclear at first, their actions were not necessarily unique to Nixon's entire White House. Nixon often viewed critics of his policies as threats to national security. Once elected, he developed an enemies list that included reporters, politicians, activists, celebrities whom he considered unfriendly to his administration. He even authorized the FBI to tap the phones of news reporters whom he felt were biased against him, as well as members of his own staff whom he distrusted. Because a judge had not authorized these wiretaps, they were unconstitutional. Thus, they represented an immense and egregious abuse of power. Nixon and his plumbers. Next slide. Nixon was also gravely concerned about secrecy. He established his own White House security operation to investigate leaks of damaging information to the press. This group was nicknamed the Plumbers because their primary task was to plug the leaks. In 1971, the Plumbers broke into the office of a psychiatrist whose clients included Daniel Ellsberg, a former defense analyst. Nixon suspected Ellsberg of leaking the Pentagon Papers, a set of secret military documents on the Vietnam War, to the New York Times. A year later, the White House plumbers carried out the botched Watergate burglary. So the importance of reporters, right? Why we need to really look to reporters as watchdogs for our government. The Watergate break-in might have been forgotten had after Nixon's reelection, if not for the work of two Washington Post reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. With the help of an anonymous source that they called Deep Throat, Woodward and Bernstein discovered that Nixon's reelection campaign had paid the plumbers to bug the Democrats' offices. More details emerged when the plumbers faced trial in 1973. Again, the part of this story that is so phenomenal is that Nixon was always going to win a second term. There was no danger of him losing that election. Yet, even with that overwhelming reality, he still abused his power egregiously. More details emerged, like I said, in 1973 when the plumbers were put on trial. During the legal proceedings, one plumber implicated the Nixon administration in the cover-up, claiming the defendants had been paid to lie in order to protect government officials. From third-rate burglary to scandal. What the White House had originally attempted to dismiss, as I said, as a third-rate burglary had become known as the Watergate scandal. As pressure to thoroughly investigate the scandal mounted, the Justice Department appointed Archibald Cox, a respected law professor, to serve as special prosecutor. A special prosecutor is a non-government lawyer appointed by the Attorney General or Congress to investigate a federal official for misconduct while in office. Okay, next slide. The Oval Office recordings. After the plumbers' trial, the Senate formed a committee to investigate the Watergate affair. In televised hearings, former White House counsel John Dean testified that Nixon had participated in efforts to cover up the White House involvement in the Watergate break-in. So now you have a direct line from the crime to the President of the United States. Another former Nixon aide revealed that President Nixon had installed a recording system in the White House, specifically in the Oval Office, that taped every conversation that Nixon had. The aide insisted that if the committee listened to the tapes, it would uncover whether the president had ordered the cover-up. Next slide. The Saturday Night Massacre. In July of 1973, the Senate Watergate Committee issued a subpoena or court order compelling Nixon to turn over several tapes. Nixon refused, invoking the right to withhold information known as executive privilege, a concept based on the constitutional separation of powers. Since the time of George Washington, presidents have argued that the separation of powers grants the executive branch the right to operate without disclosing the details of every conversation and working document to the other government branches. Over the next few months, Nixon battled both Special Prosecutor Cox and Senate committee over the release of the White House tapes. On October 20th, 1973, in what became known as the Saturday Night Massacre, Nixon fired Cox. The president's own attorney general resigned in protest. The smoking gun. In July 1974, a case known as the United States versus Nixon, the Supreme Court ruled that the president must release his tapes to the Senate. Once Nixon complied, the recordings proved beyond a doubt that he had ordered a Watergate cover-up. Next slide. Nixon resigns. Late in July, the House Judiciary Committee approved 3 articles of impeachment against Nixon, accusing him of obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. Rather than face trial and almost certain conviction in the Senate, Nixon announced his resignation on August 8, 1974. The next day, Vice President Gerald Ford was sworn in as president. Our Constitution works, Ford said. Our long national nightmare is over. Unfortunately, that wasn't really the case. I mean, if you go back and you look at trust of the president before Nixon and after Nixon, the residual effect is very, very clear. And this, in many people's opinion, didn't help. Ford pardons Nixon. To unify the country and put the Watergate mess to rest, Ford issued Nixon a presidential pardon in September. Rather than settle controversy, the pardon ignited it. Some Americans wanted Nixon tried for his alleged crimes, while others preferred to move on from Watergate. In all instances, the nation was very split on what to do with Nixon. Despite Ford's efforts to close this volatile chapter of presidential history, Americans remained deeply disillusioned with the nation's political leadership, and you can say that is still very much the case today. The presidency before Nixon and the presidency after Nixon are 2 very, very different offices. Okay, so that wraps up our video lectures for this week. I hope you guys are well. I hope you're safe, and I miss you all very much. Have a wonderful weekend, and as always, stay safe and stay well. Bye.